Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And my name is Alex Davis. I work as a literature professional based here in Derby, and delighted to be joined tonight by the author of BioWar. We're going to have a conversation about the book series itself, how it's all shaping up. Very excited for this one, having read some of the novel and the short story that goes with as well. So I just want to ask a question first of all, where the initial idea for the series emerged from?
Well, it kind of came from one or two sources, really. So initially, it was actually a part of a writing assessment at university, at the University of Derby. And I kind of went with the concept of writing for horror, but I want to, as I've got a background interest in military history, I wanted to kind of merge the two together. And I'd seen a couple of games, TV series, things like that kind of explored these concepts, and I kind of wanted to do something similar to that. And that's kind of how it all started, really. Just an experiment with mixing these two genres together.
Yeah, absolutely. What was it that drew you to the Second World War in particular as a kind of historical setting? I suppose it's one of the most kind of studied areas of history, I guess, but what was it in particular that drew you to that time period?
I think it was probably the scale of the conflict, in terms of not just the number of different nations involved, but also the sheer quantity of manpower that each nation was putting up, and in terms of the vast array of cultures and nationalities that in some cases, especially in the Allied forces, were kind of being mixed together all of a sudden. People from all different areas of just a single country that had probably never interacted with one another were all of a sudden thrown into this situation together, and needed to work together to ultimately win the war. And I think it was kind of a mixture of that scale and that need to cooperate and that need to make the team working work that I felt fit with the concept of this biopunk enemy, I suppose.
Yeah, it gives you a lovely kind of way to develop tension between the characters, because does everyone trust one another? Are they going to be able to communicate okay with one another? So it adds that element as well.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a couple of things planned that kind of follow that theme more closely further into the series. As it stands at the moment, the first full draft of BioWar Book 1 is complete. And I've started writing the second book whilst I'm going through editing for the first. The second one touches a lot more on this idea of trust issues between characters of different nationalities.
Well, I'm going to use the opportunity to leap forward a little bit, because it seems a nice moment to talk about the characters themselves. So can you tell us a bit about some of the main characters in the book and in the series?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the first things I'll mention is that on my YouTube channel, I have been gradually doing dedicated videos for each of the protagonists and some of their closest comrades where possible, or where it's relevant. But the protagonists that I came up with, really, I wanted to try and get a fairly well-rounded collection of characters from various branches of the military. So that's why, for instance, you have the tank commander, you have the Royal Commando, you have the RAF pilot, and then, of course, with the addition of the short story, you have a naval officer. The fifth, being Carl is a little bit of an odd one thrown into the mix. But it's one of those characters where he perhaps highlights some of the more grey areas in warfare.
Absolutely. And where did that kind of interest in military history come from? Is that something that's kind of been sort of passed down from the family, or is it just an interest that you picked up on your own? Where's that kind of come from?
A little bit of both, I suppose. So when I was a fair bit younger, my dad always used to play games, and I used to sit and watch him. And he'd got into, on more of a surface level, I would say, he got into historical military games.
Yeah.
I believe the first one I ever saw was Battlefield 1943 for anybody that's played that. And that was kind of where my interest began. That's where, until then, I'd had an interest in vehicles and how they worked and things like that. And it was then when I first saw that military side that kind of made me think, actually, there's a whole other world of technology and development and things like that to explore here. And as I kind of got further down that rabbit hole, that's when I started learning about not just the technology, but the context behind it, the conflicts behind it. And everything just kind of grew from there, really.
Yeah. And was it easy to kind of mingle together? Obviously, because you talk about horror, obviously you've got the horror element in the story, which we'll come to, a bit more kind of the overt horror element, I suppose, but also kind of the horror of war itself. Were those things kind of odds to one another? Did they work together nicely for you? How did you find it blending those, the real life and I suppose the artificial horror, I guess, or the fictional horror, put it that way?
Yeah. I think I found that they actually kind of work together quite well. Although I obviously don't have any military experience personally. However, from what I've read and from what I've spoken to other people who do have that experience and what they've said, actually some of those horrors of war and the individual experience and how the individual deals with them kind of work fairly well with the concept of the more overt horror, of the more, I suppose, the more fantastical horror side of it, the bioweapons.
Word for it, yes.
And that's kind of, they do mix quite well. Excuse me, in the in a written format. Especially because a lot of, I suppose, a lot of the kind of the characters' inner demons, in terms of their experiences and what they've seen, can be quite easily translated, or I suppose even made a reflection of the bioweapons themselves.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a bit of background reading, and I was going to ask that question about the level of research involved. So to write, obviously you're writing a Second World War setting, but with a kind of almost like alternate history sort of vibe. So how much research did you have to do to get those the time period right?
Quite a lot.
I thought that might be.
Yeah, so it's in some ways, some parts of it were fairly easy to put together, but there are so many little nuggets of information that have to change. And a good example is the technology side of things is something that I put a lot of research into, because some of the technologies that I decided to include in the story either hadn't been technically designed yet in practice, but had been in theory. So it's kind of some of the research kind of went into, at least in 1947 and beforehand, at what level were some of these technologies? Were they being tested but perhaps not entered into service yet? Or had they been just completely ruled out as wildly impractical?
Yeah.
A good example for this is the specific aircraft that the protagonist Henry and his wingmen fly, the Gloucester Meteor. That entered service in late 1944. The first variants of it did anyway.
Yeah.
The variant that I've included specifically in the book wasn't technically tested until the 1950s.
Yeah.
However, when you consider the context of the story and you consider how the situation that the characters are in and the situation that the world is in the story, chances are that development would have been rushed through a bit quicker.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the situation would have demanded that change being made sooner. And therefore those technological developments happen quicker because there's a necessity for them to do so.
Yeah. And therefore you're kind of trying to balance almost like a research task and the sort of world building task. So you're trying to create things in the world that make sense, but may, as you say, never have existed at the time, or may even like never have existed at all. How did you go about like getting that balance right?
It has been quite difficult in places to manage that. But generally speaking, I tried to go with the idea of reasonable plausibility.
Yeah.
So given the right amount of desperation and the right tools, could engineers have whipped this weapon or that vehicle into shape within the time frame and would have been seen as a good use of resources? That's generally how I've had to muddle through it. Fairly good example of that is the first protagonist, one of the first protagonists that you meet in book one, William Rowe. He commands a variant of Sherman that is semi-fictional. So it is loosely based on a Yugoslavian modified Sherman tank. But I've had to rearrange some details here and there. I've had to kind of make it make sense that actually, because of other weapons becoming available, the British decided to upgun a lot of their Shermans to have equipment that they wouldn't have necessarily had in 1947 in our timeline. So there's a lot of bits where I've had to think, can I realistically justify this being a necessity? I'd say there is one exception to my rule on that one. That's something that I added in purely for the cool factor. And just completely ignored any sort of practicality rules. And that was the airships. So they're introduced in William's first chapter, and they are American aircraft carriers that they essentially, rather than building them as surface vessels, they simply take the concept of having runways, but they just attach them to the sides of an airship, with the idea being, wouldn't it be great if we could have an aircraft carrier, that idea of an airfield that can be anywhere at any time, but have that fly over land when it needs to. And I found actually, if I still haven't decided technologically how it works, but if it was possible technology wise, I imagine the US Navy would have been very interested in that concept. So that was kind of one of the ones where I had to forgo the whole technology plausibility and kind of think that that one's got to go in there really just for the cool factor.
Yeah,
But,
yeah, absolutely. You gotta have one. You gotta have one, I think.
yeah.
Talk about obviously the title being BioWar, but I want to kind of talk about the bioweapons as that's sort of described in the book, and the kind of as a sort of type of zombie or a sort of take on a zombie, I suppose. What was it that kind of led you to kind of deviate away from that classic kind of zombie trope, I suppose, because it's not a zombie as, again, some readers may know it or some readers may think of it.
Yeah. So there was a kind of a mix of sources, I suppose, for that one. Classic, the idea of a classic zombie was kind of a big inspiration for it. However, there was a really good example, which during the kind of editing stage of this recording, I will put some clips on to demonstrate. A good example was Zombie Army 4, which was a game that was a big influence on the creation of BioWar. And that kind of toyed with the concept of not just having people as zombies, but being able to have vehicles as zombies and what they would look like and roughly what kind of purpose they would fulfill.
Yeah.
And that was one of the main inspirations in terms of the, well, realistically, if you had a parasitic organism that was intelligent enough to work out how a piece of technology worked, would that parasite still behave as a parasite with a piece of technology, with a vehicle or with a weapon?
Yeah.
And how would it adapt that piece of technology to suit its own needs? And that's kind of how that concept came to be. It was that sort of experimentation with, well, the kind of the classic zombies concept is kind of, well, if you're in a tank, then theoretically you stand a better chance against zombies if you're in a tank.
One would think so, yeah.
But if the zombies can use a tank, you're in a bit more of there's a bit more of a predicament there.
Yeah, it's a whole other question.
Yeah, especially when those tanks can grow legs to get across terrain quicker than what a tank might usually be able to. And that's kind of where all the extra fantastical elements came to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant stuff. I've got to ask sort of one more question about, I suppose, the series in particular. Kind of, again, is there a sort of comment, or is there a sort of point you're making about kind of the use of biological warfare? Is there a kind of broader point there in the series itself? Obviously we do gets talked about in the modern era more now, I suppose, more now than it did in World War II in many respects. So is that something you're kind of picking up on as a thread?
Yeah, absolutely. So initially it wasn't as much, but as I was writing the book, it kind of became more apparent to me that actually, not just in terms of what I wanted to write and what I wanted to express concern over, but as well as kind of looking at actually how do the characters feel about this? What do characters think about in terms of the future? Obviously, it's the bioweapons are very much a kind of genie out of the bottle situation. There wouldn't be that many people on Earth when the war finishes in the book that wouldn't now know that these creatures were possible.
Yeah.
And that with enough time and engineering, they could be brought back again. And in terms of anything kind of biological weapon related, that's always going to be a risk.
Yeah.
There may be, somebody may find an antidote for one. Somebody may find a type of material that they could use to create protective clothing. A good example being gas attacks. Obviously, gas attacks started being used kind of around about the First World War. Although they were used significantly less after that, there was still always the threat of them. And especially if we look at the world today, and we see that that threat is still a genuine cause for concern. And while, yes, one can create a protective suit for that, there is still always that threat that there may be a new one at some point that we have not been prepared for.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And it's that, I suppose, one of the points that I make coming towards the end of the first book, and certainly what becomes the main point for books that are in the series, that are further on in the series, is that every action, no matter how small, has a consequence.
Yeah.
And especially when you start screwing with nature, those consequences can have, well, those actions can have consequences that are further reaching than anybody could possibly predict. And that's kind of one of my main points. It's not worth tampering with what we have for the sake of another country disliking another, or for a political means, or it is simply not worth that risk. And that's kind of what BioWar in the end comes to teach as a lesson, is that at least in this thankfully fictional reality, Germany pays the ultimate price for meddling that far. They almost cease to exist as a country, and it's pretty much only thanks to a very small group of people who were just in the right place at the right time that Germany even continues to exist, because of that, the rest of the world as well. But yeah, so I suppose that's kind of the lesson in the end.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. I've got a few last questions I wanted to ask about kind of writing more broadly, I suppose, and the book itself. I suppose the first thing I was picking up was the illustrations. Obviously, a lot of kind of images and illustrations that I know you're working on and sort of putting together for the book and the series. Tell us a bit about those. Is that something that, what's your kind of style and the feel you're going for with those?
Absolutely. So illustration has always been kind of, it's been a hobby of mine for quite a long time. It has been really since I probably started at university, and it's been since then that any of my writing projects has usually been accompanied with illustrations, either to help myself solidify a concept, or just to kind of show with the piece of writing as a kind of an accompanying, I suppose, additional form of art and expression to go with the writing. In terms of what I've been aiming for with the specific illustrations I've done so far, in terms of the character art, that very much comes down to something a friend once told me. That I dare say the friend will be watching this video when it comes out, and to them I say, you very much know who you are, and you are solely to blame for this. But they once told me that when they were reading BioWar, how they kind of pictured it in their mind was as an anime. And that's kind of, in terms of, at least for the character art for actual characters in the series, that's kind of where some of the inspiration came for that, for the style of illustration. For the bioweapons themselves, that was very much kind of just going down the how absolutely vomit inducing can I make these things look. But in terms of the characters, it was very much more kind of playing to that stylized, I suppose, almost that heroic stature, that kind of grandiose sense you get with characters drawn in that style. Because ultimately a lot of the characters in BioWar that appear are the unlikely hero types, whether they know it or not. A lot of some of them know it and really don't want to be seen as heroes. But portraying them in that art style, portraying them using that kind of manga illustration style to portray them in that more fantastical, almost heroic stature, almost helps to kind of get across how these characters are seen by other people in the series when perhaps they don't want to be.
Or they don't see themselves that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of them see themselves as the absolute rock bottom of society, especially Charlie. If he was real, he would probably hate me for saying that, but he does not have a very high opinion of himself. It's going to take a few more books. I will say this now: it's going to take a few more books before he actually gains much confidence in himself. But he is very much one of those characters where people will say, "How in God's name have you been able to do that? That's incredible." Or they will say, "Wow, you did that in a single day." Or, "I can't believe you took that thing on and won." And his answer is very much similar to how Henry behaves. Actually, he's very much kind of that was luck. Well, no, that was just because I had the rest of my squad there helping me. He doesn't want to be seen as the hero in that situation because he doesn't believe where he has come from and what his background is gives him the right to be a hero. But that's kind of something that's explored more in the book itself.
Absolutely. And to just mention on the first book, obviously you talked about kind of starting the whole concept at university. I mean, how long has it taken? I know you mentioned you're still editing as we speak, but how long has it taken you to get that first novel down?
Oh, I would say probably about 4 or 5 years. I'd say it's been a lengthy one. Granted, there was some breaks, partially because my interests tend to kind of flip from one to the other. So it's very much been a case of waiting until my interests fall back into Second World War to write about that era. What it has meant, however, is that as my interests have flipped around, I've been writing or started writing different parts of the series that take place in different time settings. So there was it's taken a long time for book one to get to where it is now, partially because I was distracted with the rest of the series, and kind of formulating the whole rest of the timeline. But I think ultimately that paid off because there is elements that I have set up in book one that I wouldn't have been able to set up if I hadn't have started looking at the timeline for the rest of the series. So doing that has allowed me to, although it's taken longer for book one to get to this stage, it has meant that it now feels like there is more in BioWar to pick up on in the next books. There's particular, especially when we get to conversations regarding things like time travel, pre and post cognition, and things like that. There's a little bit of that comes in later into the book. I'm not going to say exactly how, but it will raise questions for readers, which will then be answered in subsequent books.
Brilliant stuff. I suppose that's really my final question. Is obviously you've got kind of grand plans for the series, and how many books do you see it being? Can you kind of tell us anything about sort of, obviously this one, Second World War? It sounds like we're going to be going forward in time, maybe even backwards in time. So kind of what's next on the slate? Can you tell us kind of broadly, without giving too much away?
Yes, absolutely. Well, let's see. So the second book, which is the one I'm working on now, is still set in the Second World War. It is set roughly around about the same time. but focuses on a single character.
Mhm.
And that character is mentioned a fair amount in BioWar.
Mhm.
They appear once. Apologize, they appear twice. However, I stand corrected to get they appear 3 times. I can tell you the locations they do appear in though. So they let me think. They appear in Germany twice, and they appear in Egypt once. And there is enough mystery around this character that by the end of book 1, I thought, I can't leave his story like that.
Yeah.
He needs his own. Yes. So there will be quite a few elements in BioWar, particularly surrounding Carl as a character and his interactions with this other mystery character, where there's a lot of unanswered questions by the end, which then become very apparent in book 2.
Yeah.
But to answer the rest of your question, there's quite a lot planned in the timeline in terms of different eras and different years. So we can go, it spans through a couple of different real world conflicts as well. Korea, Vietnam, potentially, though nothing quite confirmed yet. But potentially also the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s. However, there is then elements of the series that go much further. And although I can't say much about this particular part of the series, I can give you a year as to the kind of where I plan to stop the timeline for active development, and that is around about the year 2476.
Wow. Okay. So plenty of books and plenty of stories to look forward to then.
Absolutely.
Brilliant stuff. That's a really great talk. Again, really great to find out a bit more about the series. We look forward to seeing book 1 out there on bookshelves sometime soon, and fantastic to see all the development going into the series, all that research. Yeah, wonderful to chat. Thanks so much for your time this evening, and yeah, look forward to speaking again soon.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.